Welcome to Kingston Writers Fest. My name is Barbara Bell, and I'm the artistic director of the festival. I'm very pleased tonight to present our Canadian values, Can They Heal the World? I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we are generating this online presentation is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. We gratefully acknowledge these Indigenous nations for their historical and ongoing guardianship of this land. We agree to peaceably share in responsibility for stewardship of this land, its waters, and all of its biodiversity. All those who come to live and work here are responsible for honoring these relationships in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We're really very grateful to those organizations and individuals who support Kingston Writers Fest, and in particular, we would like to thank the Office of the Principal at Queen's University, who's our community partner for this event, Ryder, Burbidge, Hurley Foster, author patrons of John Stackhouse, and Blurred Words Book Club, author patrons of Ben Charland, the Canada Council, GG Books, Heritage Canada, Ontario Arts Council, the City of Kingston and Kingston Arts Council, and also special thanks to Tourism Kingston for their marketing support. And thank you to you, all of you who are joining us tonight, and to those of you who have donated to the festival. This event is 45 minutes long, and it will include a brief question and answer period. A few housekeeping notes. Complete our online survey for the chance to win a pass to next year's festival or a basket of books. Details when you log on to the survey on the website. We'd love to know where you're joining us from tonight. So please let us know using the question and answer button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And you can also post your questions for John there. Be sure to join us tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Eastern Time for Reaching for Hope, Transformation of a World in Peril, featuring Thomas Homer Dixon, and Friday evening at 8 Eastern Time for the Robertson Davies Lecture delivered by Desmond Cole. I'll move on to introduce Ben Charland now, and then he can take things over from there. Ben is a writer, podcaster, and creative consultant, and an enthusiast endowed with an unrelenting curiosity about everything. He hosts a weekly podcast, What on Earth is Going On, which is a show centered on genuine dialogue with people who think deeply and are keen to consider the big questions. Ben has interviewed some of the best minds out there, including festival alumni Rosemary Sullivan, Terry O'Reilly, Guy Gavriel Kay, Sally Armstrong, Thomas King, among many others. I highly recommend his engaging and wide-ranging podcast, which you can find online at wogoshow.com, that's WOEGOSHOW.com, or by searching What on Earth is Going On podcast. Ben is currently based in Whitehorse, Yukon, where he is as engaged as ever. Please welcome Ben Charland.
I am trying to restart my video. Just give me a second. Hello, everybody. It says the host needs to restart my video, and there we go. I think it's up now. Thank you so much, Barbara, for the wonderful introduction, as always. I'm really, really pleased to be here today to talk to John Stackhouse and to take your questions to him. So just a reminder, you want to ask a question, go into that Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and at any time during this conversation, just feel free to ask your question, and I'll get to that in the last probably 10 or 15 minutes of our conversation. John Stackhouse is a best-selling author and an award-winning journalist with over 3 decades of experience, going all the way back to when he was the editor of the Queen's Journal in Kingston. Before taking on the role of editor-in-chief for the Globe and Mail in 2009, just as the news was moving over to the mobile phone, John worked for the paper as the foreign correspondent and then foreign editor. His writing is infused effortlessly with both the itchy feet and the deep Rolodex of any good journalist. Since 2015, John has served as the Senior Vice President for the CEO of the Royal Bank of Canada, advising on economic, technological, and social change. Clearly, RBC's David McKay recognizes that John is one of Canada's leading thinkers about our country's place in the world, the forces of disruption on media and technology, and now, with his new book, Planet Canada, which is right here, how our expats are shaping the future, John is leading the conversation once again. This time, it's about a critical subject that we Canadians have at worst ignored and at best taken for granted for decades. And that subject is our Canadian diaspora, our expats abroad. Ladies and gentlemen of our own very disrupted digital diaspora of the Kingston Writers Fest, please welcome John Stackhouse. And John, I think we're going to get your video up in just 1 second.
Here I am. Thank you, Ben. Great to be with you even remotely, but thank you for the introduction.
John, it's a real pleasure to be here with you, digitally as we are. I'm so excited to talk with you about your book. And trust me, if the audience doesn't ask any questions, I've got probably 3 hours worth about how you wrote the book and what these principles are that you're really grappling onto, which I think are really profound. I was an expat myself for most of my 20s in London and Paris, and then in much of Africa. It was a big part of my life, definitely a cornerstone of who I was then and who I am now. But I did at the time think, wow, I met Canadians as I was traveling, where I was living, and thought that we were a really great people to travel, a really great people to be abroad. We seem to have the characteristics that you talk about in your book to make us good citizens of the world. I didn't realize, though, until I read your book, what was obvious and should have been obvious to me at the time, which is that our country and specifically our government are pretty terrible at helping that diaspora. And I remember back to when I was an expat, I never had the maple leaf on my backpack. And actually, I think that's Americans who mostly do that to pretend that they're Canadians. But I remember going to Trafalgar Square after Team Canada won the gold medal in 2010 at the Olympic Games. And there were 5 other people there, and it fizzled out after about 10 or 15 minutes. Everyone wanted to come to something that would be maybe prepared. And of course, the Embassy of Canada was just on Trafalgar Square in London. And there was no planning, no preparation, no support. And that is exactly one of the big themes of your book. And I guess to start us off, why is that?
I'm laughing at your story because Mike Myers, the comedian, in his book on Canada, has a great story of him with, I'm blanking on the screenwriter's name, another Canadian, after another gold medal. I think it was an earlier Olympics. Just wanted to go and celebrate. So they're in LA. They went to Rodeo Drive where there's a Roots outlet. They figured, well, at least we can hug each other and sing. And I think they sang "Oh Canada." So there is this humble patriotism among Canadians, and it grows. I discovered the longer people are away, and often the farther they are away. And I hope we can get into a discussion about identity, about geography, about values. So these are all things I'm trying to come to grips with as a Canadian, and I think we as a country need to be more confident with. But we don't recognize, and this is why I set out to do the book, because I lived for 8 years abroad in New Delhi, traveled through dozens of countries as a foreign correspondent, and would always meet Canadians in the unlikeliest places doing really interesting things. So I didn't appreciate that about my people, my country. And then I got back to Canada and noticed there was kind of a chiseling away of the rights and privileges of overseas Canadians. We can get into that because it was sparked by some of the ne'er-do-wells who made headlines, but it also tapped into a bit of a conversely to that global Canadian view. There's also a small town parochial Canadian mindset. We can be very small towny, and the people who sort of complain about the brain drain, who describe the carpetbaggers who have taken their passport and gone off to Hollywood or London or wherever and not doing their patriotic thing and staying home to build the country. That's our small town, and I'm not picking out small towns. It's just a parochial mindset of Canadians. And we got to come to grips with this because, and this was the middle of the 2010s. We're shrinking as a country. I mean, we're a huge country, but in terms of our global relevance, we're not really a middle power. We can, pat ourselves on the back as a middle power. We're a small power. And if you don't agree with that in 2020 and 2030, we'll be a small power. I mean, we're just being overtaken by others. So if, as a people of 40 million, and maybe we double to 80 million at some point in this century, if we want to be influential in the world, maybe even just out of self-interest, because we need the world to kind of function a certain way for us to be okay in it, but maybe we want the world to be different, whether it's climate change or human rights or other issues, we are going to have to approach the world in a different way. It can't be as a nation state on our own. That's why we lost the Security Council vote, because we thought, hey, we're this Personian Canada. No one cares about that anymore. But we've got 2 million, maybe 3 million, we can get into the number counting here, Canadians all over the world doing incredible things, really well liked and respected, usually where they are, who should be kind of active parts of leaders of Team Canada and taking us deeper into the world. And that's kind of the tension, but the ambition I wanted to get at in the book.
It's really profound reading your book, learning about Canadians abroad, these 2 to 3 million people who are living in other countries for various reasons, whether it's just for a couple of years to be a student, which from your book I learned are very few. Of Western and developed countries, Canada sends some of the fewest numbers per capita of undergrads out to the world, back to that parochial mentality that we seem to have. But the ones who do go, the ones who go for work or to live, to change the world, they carry with them a Canadian identity, or they carry with them a mindset that is particularly Canadian. And it's a theme of your book, how effective that mindset is and how needed, how necessary that mindset is. Could you talk a bit about what that Canadian mentality is and why it is so important for the world today?
Absolutely. And it's, I set out to write the book in 2015, before Donald Trump, before Brexit, certainly well before COVID. And as my editor and I were revising it because of Trump and Brexit, and then we had to delay it because of COVID, I wrestled with its relevance and wondered, maybe my thesis has just been blown up. Maybe we're into a nationalistic age, and this notion of kind of a global citizen and a global Canadian is more nostalgic. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, no. The Canadian values that we prize, cherish most are going to be more necessary in a post-Trump, post-Brexit world, and absolutely in a post-COVID world. The most important Canadian value, and I know that's going to make some people shiver, I don't say it lightly, because it is a value, is mutual accommodation. And we don't own that. There are many other people, vast numbers in the world, who conduct mutual accommodation every day in so many ways. But as a people, we have developed both principles and practices as well as a legality of mutual accommodation in the way we govern ourselves as a society and what we expect of each other that the world desperately needs. The word compromise has become a pejorative, and it's actually, I was raised to believe compromise is a strength, is an ability to find a middle ground that isn't your ground necessarily, and this is what mutual accommodation is. Bring differing views together, call it inclusion, call it pluralism, all sorts of things. It's what being Canadian is. In so many parts of the world which are divided, which are very binary and even isolated, this ability to build bridges is a huge strength. And I came across and was really fascinated to meet people in international companies or working in other governments or in universities who would say, you know what, I didn't appreciate it until I was here, that my ability to listen to 5 different views around the table and try to bring people together to a common view, just kind of what we do as Canadians, and then we say we're sorry for doing that, is something others value. And it was Dominic Barton, who's now our ambassador to China, who was the global head of McKinsey and Company, spent decades overseas, from London to Hong Kong to Seoul, and constantly traveling the world. He told me in a meeting, he can spot the Canadian. He said the Canadian, although he said sometimes it was Dutch, sort of like I would sometimes get tripped up because the Dutch are kind of like this too, were the ones who would ask a question and then listen to the answer. So believe it or not, like most nationalities pose a question just as a rhetorical setup for their own statement. So those are the Canadian values that I think we can be proud of and not arrogant about, but understand that those are actually exportable values the world is going to need as it grapples with a very rougher set of international circumstances than what we saw in the last decade.
Well, and this is actually something that the New York Times writer and columnist Thomas Friedman talks about, the need for soft skills, the need for the need to get away from those hard mathematical science skills, because honestly, computers are pretty capable of doing those things, but being able to sit in a room and listen to other people and bring people together under a common vision, that is something that a human being today, at least, only can do. And those who are interested in compromise and capable of listening are going to do a lot better. There's another metaphor in the book about the difference between a submarine and an aircraft carrier. And this was applied to big companies. That do you want your company, say in Silicon Valley, to be an aircraft carrier, or do you want it to be a submarine? And submarines have a lot more staying power in the modern world, but I think it applies to individuals as well. I think the sense that not just staying under the surface, but being able to surface only when necessary and not always being exposed. And what is the big thing a submarine does is listen to what's going on around rather than project, but hear what's happening. And I thought it was a really potent metaphor, not just for companies, but for maybe that Canadian value set.
I hadn't thought that about submarines being listening devices. That's a beautiful way of seeing the Canadianness of the submarine.
There's another thing you talk about, which is the opposable minds of globalization. Can we dig into that a little bit, because it's another way to kind of view, or another angle from which to see this perspective? Well,
that comes as an idea from Roger Martin, the former dean of the Rotman Business School at U of T, who's now living in Miami, so an expat himself again. He's been back and forth over the decades. And Roger describes the Canadian, it's actually not a Canadian mind. He wrote a business book called The Opposable Mind, which is about how business leaders need to not have strength of their conviction, which is what so many business schools teach, like know what you know and stand for it, kind of argue your patch. And the opposable mind is actually being able to see something from different perspectives. So I may have a strong point of view, but and this is in a way what empathy is being able to pivot or get into someone else's shoes and see it differently, and then talk it through, understand these different perspectives, and you will get to a solution that is probably very different than the one, if you have two opposable minds and you're open-minded, you'll probably get to a third position. And that's that idea of compromise, of finding a middle ground, but being open-minded enough to work your way to a different position. And his view was, and he did case studies on very successful companies and organizations that had this culture of challenging, but being open to finding exploring different perspectives. And when I read his book, I reached out to him. I said, Roger, that's in a way what Canada is, what Canadians are. We got into a good debate about it, hopefully of opposable minds, but ultimately that was his thesis as well, that this is the opposable mind is the Canadian mind. We don't stand up and say, this is the way it must be, or this is the way we do it, you should do it too. So, we have, back to the point about mutual accommodation, we do some incredible things in this country. Our post-secondary education system, I would argue, is the best system in the world. Colleges and universities. Canada is, if you're to start, in fact, if you're to start kindergarten anywhere on the planet, Canada is the place to do that. And if you're going first year, Canada is the place to do that. You'll get to a better outcome. We do post-secondary incredibly well. We do immigration incredibly well. But we don't go to other countries and say, this is how you should do immigration, or this is how you should do community colleges. So look, this works for us at this point in time. Or let's talk about how it might work for you. Position. And we know, and I saw this overseas, I mean, it was just nauseating and baffling. You know, you hear the Americans or the Brits or the French, just, and increasingly the Chinese and the Koreans or the Japanese say, like, how we do it. You should do it like this. Well, it's probably not going to work because cultures, geographies, context matters.
Fascinating idea that we have to realize who we are, maybe in order to do that better when we're abroad as expats or just abroad visiting and meeting other people, to recognize that what makes us work well with others, what makes us these great CEOs of corporations in Silicon Valley, or lawyers, or artists. You have a whole chapter about artists in the book in Los Angeles and elsewhere, Bollywood and India. That what makes us good at these things are the very things that sometimes we feel not too proud about, that we're a little bit quieter, a little bit meeker, but it's actually not about being quiet or meek. It's about being inquisitive and to be open and have those opposable minds of globalization, as you say so eloquently in your chapter. I just wanted to pause for a second and remind everyone, if you've got a question, put it in the Q&A down below. We'll get to them at the end. You don't have to wait for the end. You can put them in right now. It won't distract me or John, I promise. And I also wanted to point out at the top of your screen, you might see that Patrick Dean, principal of Queen's University, has joined us. He's going to say a few words at the end of this event. And don't worry, when you saw him join, he's not one of those guys that's going to flash us in the middle of the Zoom call. He's supposed to be here. You might remember that from the beginning of the pandemic when people were hijacking Zoom calls. I wanted to ask you about other countries that seem to do this so well, seem to support and help navigate and manage their diasporas so well. Israel, Singapore, to name a couple, but there are so many. What are they doing well, and why is that? Why are we not doing the same thing, at least on the order of government? We talked about culture, but what is it that they're doing? Yeah.
No, this is a real problem for us as a country, and I hope if people take away any message from the book, it's full of inspiring stories. I hope it especially inspires younger people to look at the world as an opportunity for them. But we as Canadians have to come to grips with this. The power of our government, of our military, of our institutions is diminishing relative to everything else in the world. That kind of stealth force of ours, our expats, is our strategic power in the 2020s for diaspora diplomacy, not soft diplomacy, which people kind of think is mushy. No. Other countries are incredibly effective at it, and I'll maybe speak to a couple of cases about that. But why don't we recognize this? Well, first, we don't even recognize that we have a diaspora. And I hope this helps us say, yes, I call it the 11th province. We have an 11th province. Let's declare it as such, celebrate it, get in touch with it, and work with it, and stop saying they left, good riddance, unless they're a Hollywood star and maybe we'll enjoy their comments on the Emmy Awards or whatever. So we have to acknowledge this 11th province first of all. But then we have to set up systems and structures to work with them. Understanding kind of the stealthiness that will be required, us being a smaller power. So Israel and Singapore are very different countries, but they work with their diasporas in very effective ways. They know if you leave Israel or Singapore, you are essentially followed, and it isn't in a surreptitious tracking way, although that may happen in a number of countries. But it's just staying in touch with people. And I talked to people in government and said, well, we got to be really careful with privacy here, and people don't want to be contacted. I talked to hundreds of Canadians around the world. They're like, what? Like, I'm waiting for the government to contact me, or I've actually called and emailed and written, and no one called me or reached out to me. So we got to kind of respect privacy, but not use that as an excuse to get in touch with this enormously valuable community or population. So Israel and Singapore stay in touch with people. They let them know what's needed of them, and it isn't for kind of small ball stuff. The Harper government, for instance, tried to activate expats to lobby in Washington on behalf of the Keystone Pipeline. Okay, like I setting aside opinions about the Keystone Pipeline, I get the political instinct. That's small ball. Like, don't do it for a single issue gain. This is a strategic investment, and you need to activate this population, but you need to listen to them as well. So one of the recommendations I put forward in the book is create a responsibility of Rideau Hall for the Governor General. So you're taking it away from politics. Make the Governor General kind of the commander in chief of expats, or the expat in chief, who has responsibility for this population, who has a budget to set up organizing events and connections, communications with the population, who can bring them back. Maybe we have an event every other year at Rideau Hall where the 100 best expats or most interesting expats from different walks of life come. Maybe subgroups in each region elect or select, their 10 or nominate 10 expats to go from East Asia back to the Rideau Hall gathering. Learn from each other, not just the celebrities, but people doing uncelebrated but interesting work. And then critically, and this is what other countries do really well, listen to them. Say, okay, like what are you seeing in the world? You are our eyes and ears in a very different way from a diplomatic mission. What should we know about the world, and what should maybe we do? Maybe we should do differently. Other countries give them political representation. Italy has seats in Parliament. Probably not something most Canadians would go for, but I think it's an important signal. India, which has a huge diaspora, and we know this in Canada, not only gives a parliamentary voice, but has a department within the Foreign Affairs Ministry to represent expats, and has special visas, not just for expats, but for their kids. So if you are a Canadian-born child of an Indian overseas resident, they're called, you can get a visa to go work in India for a term, because they want to maintain that connectivity. We tend to sort of cut the sinews or the connecting threads after a generation, and certainly after two. Lastly, we need to come to grips with citizenship. And this is, I think this is a really important issue for us to come to grips with as a country. What is citizenship? Does it involve is it determined by geography? Estonia now has digital citizenship. You and I can become citizens of Estonia. Just go online and apply. Maybe that's a little too out there for us, but how do we think about citizenship that transcends geography? How can I become a Canadian? If I leave the country, yes, we're okay with that. If I stay outside of the country for, let's say, decades, well, Canadians get a little uncertain about that. What about my kids if they're born elsewhere? Can they be Canadian citizens? What about people who want to, and I think we're going to have to come to grips with this with university students. What if they want to come here to study but can't physically get here? So the government's created a temporary bridge. They can stay where they are. Okay, if that works, should we consider giving them longer term visas even if they aren't here? Those are the sorts of questions in a post-national age that I think are not only going to be pressing for Canada, but create a big opportunity for us where, again, like we're just 40 million people. we talk about becoming 80 million or 100 million people, that's actually going to be hard to get to. Maybe we have to kind of extend our boundaries of citizenship without diminishing at all the requirements or expectations of that.
And perhaps, John, it'll be easier than we think, because I learned in your book that there was no such thing as a Canadian citizen until 1947. Prior to that, we were British subjects. And to think that the whole concept of a Canadian citizen is so new, and then of course was revised in 1977, revised again, as you mentioned, under the Harper government, it doesn't seem to be that hard to maybe revise this again. And one example where this is working, and again, you talk about education in your book, universities really try to connect with their alumni all around the world. I don't know how well Queen's is doing with you, John, but I know that universities try really, really hard to maintain these relationships. And when I first learned about this whole field of work in a university, I thought, oh, it's for money. They're just looking for donations down the road to keep themselves funded as government funding drops. But then I realized, no, and in talking to people, it's not really about that so much as about building a university community that is greater than the physical university itself. And that is a very 21st century concept that will make universities of today relevant and necessary, whereas the brick and mortar institutions, may become less and less relevant in the digital age, especially accelerated by this pandemic. Does that make sense in how you?
No, absolutely, and that is very much the kind of thinking we need as a country, where the community of Canadians in can be in Shanghai or in Colombo, Sri Lanka, or Paris, should be doing more than coming together to watch a hockey game or celebrate Canada Day. Or if there's a visiting dignitary, be invited to Canada House in Trafalgar Square. Those are all fine and good, but there should be a much more active, dynamic, engaged, and interactive community where if I'm a Canadian, let's say in Hong Kong, I'm going to, it's almost like belonging to a club or an association where I'm going to be plugging into it and going to it physically when I can. As much as I would to any other club or association. And a number of expats said to me when they lived overseas, they determined their identity usually by their employer, then their education background, their university, thirdly, their nationality. So I would, if I worked for a multinational, I'd hang out with those folks. But then I go to my alumni club. Or meet at a pub with them or have events. And it was only like thirdly, kind of once a year, get together with Canadians. We have to reverse that order, or at least get that Canadian association much more active than it is, and bring other people into it so that you want to be with the Canadians. If you're living in Hong Kong, that's where the great conversations, that's where the great parties, that's where the great film events are happening. And we've diminished our cultural, what used to be called cultural diplomacy, so much for cost-cutting reasons that we don't appreciate what we've lost. What the British Council does, or what the French and Italian governments do with the export of their culture, is really impressive. China's doing this in a very different way and not necessarily a positive way, but we need to appreciate that's going on, is going on here and in our country. Other countries do that very actively here in Canada. You have Italian newspapers that are funded by the Italian government. We need to be leaning much more forward as Canadians, not just for the sake of or the benefit of those those expats. It's to bring those expats together and use them as a kind of a force to extend our influence, but also bring the world to us in positive ways.
Last question for you, John, just before I turn it back to the audience and see what their questions are in the Q&A. I haven't looked yet, but I hope that they're growing in number, which is about the process of writing this book. I mean, as you mentioned, you talked to hundreds of people, obviously did a lot of research, but this book is full of of really interesting stories. It almost puts me to shame. Like, I'm thinking, what am I doing? Look at all these people who are succeeding as Canadians so well around the world. Not just because, I mean, they're obviously talented, but also because they're solid people who listen and think and work well with others. And there's so many of them. And I just wondered, how did you even start to find all of these people? Yeah.
Yeah, it was a marathon and took some rigor as well as probably accidents of research to bring to a close. I started it as a research project at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto, where I'm lucky enough to be a fellow, excuse me, in addition to my day job at RBC. And they arranged for me to put together a team of grad students, and we spent a term researching this issue just to lay the foundation of the thesis, really. And I was able to work with that foundation over the next several years. But one of the critical things we did was gather census data. And we also worked with Facebook to do a mapping of people on Facebook who identified as Canadian. There's been much debate about how many Canadians are overseas. There's no census of it. We don't track it as a country. And there are some skeptics who say, no, that 2 million figure is overstated. So I thought, well, let's do some quantitative analysis here. And the Facebook data got us to about 2 million. And this is 5 years ago. And then other census numbers and calculations and surveys had it more about 2.5 million. So I can say very confidently it's somewhere between 2 and 3 million Canadians living, working, studying outside of the country. I would love to speak to all 2 million of them, but couldn't. So wanted to get a good cross-section, a diversity of experiences, of geographies, of backgrounds. And I guess the curse of being a reporter is everyone I interviewed would then turn me on to 3 or 5 others. And sort of 2 or 3 years later, I had this mass of interviews and just had to say enough, like just stop it, or maybe that's what my editor said to me. I just have to write it. But we wanted to create a narrative arc to it, to establish the thesis, to give history. So I go back into the 1800s and track sort of many great chapters of Canadian expatriation. We were there at the creation of Hollywood as well as vaudeville. We built the rural health and education systems in Formosa, which is now Taiwan, and rural China. Bethune gets all the notoriety, but it was Bob McClure and a whole range of other Canadians who built what the communists took as the rural health networks system that still in some ways exists to today. So there's a great history of this around the world. And then I wanted to have a bit of a geographic tour. So I go physically through Silicon Valley, Hollywood, Japan, China, South Asia, Middle East, Europe, and Africa. Try to just give a sense and take people on a bit of a trip, get them into the lives of some really interesting people, some of them famous, like Jim Cameron, the movie director, and Mark Carney, and many of them people you've never heard of who are just fascinating Canadians. I love the Stowskis. It's a young couple who got up and went to Korea, and they're now in Japan, and they are 2 of the biggest YouTube stars in Asia, and they love telling about how being Canadian actually is their secret sauce to being a YouTube star in Asia. I could go on forever with the research because it was just fascinating, the people I got to meet, but then wanted to bring it to a close and get it published, but also inject a bit of policy discussion at the end, because there's some important choices for us to come to grips with as a country in terms of how do we define citizenship? Who do we give it to? Who do we allow to keep it? Who do we allow to vote? If someone's been out of the country for 25 years, should they be able to vote in a Canadian election? Should they have to pay taxes to do that? Should their children be able to come to Queen's University as a under the local, the national tuition fee, or should they pay as a foreigner? Lots of important questions there that I really hope we can start to wrestle with as a country, because as we come out of this crisis, this opportunity is there for Canada to work with this global population, to get Canadians out there into the world. They may be itching to get out there, but use them for our benefit, but also for the world's benefit. That's, I think, something Canadians truly want. We want a better world as well as a better Canada, and this is a way of maybe helping to address both.
I would just say that the way you framed that about bringing the policy discussion at the end, you may have done that, but it feels like the policy analysis is baked in from beginning to end of the book, and it fits seamlessly into the conversations you have with these people. So by the end of the book, it's a very clear clarion call to how can we make this better for our betterment as a country. But speaking of one of these expats, we've got one of them joining us and has asked a question from Indonesia, Mark Solis. Who actually says that he has a very active WhatsApp community of Canadians there helping each other, and a small group of them gathering for dinner tonight to get some of their Canadian on. He just finished watching the leaders' speeches in reaction to the speech from the throne, and was concerned by some of the rhetoric that positioned us against others. What concrete steps should political leaders take contextualizing Canadianness, but staying deeply embedded within a rich global community within this changing world?
Yeah, wow, what a great question, and thanks for joining the conversation. I truly hope you and your friends in Indonesia buy the book. You can get it on Amazon or on just go to our website at Penguin Random House, and there's a good order page there. There's a digital version and an audio version. So I want to put that plug in because I do want this book to inspire as well as influence Canadians around the world. We are bridge builders, and you can't build bridges. I mean, this is going to sound overly cliched, but you can't build bridges and close doors at the same time. And it's very difficult, especially in this charged political world that we live in, to take a bridge building position. It's much easier, certainly in politics, to go to a pole to either side of where a bridge might be, because you do not need a majority to win in most democracies these days. And in fact, you do much better in the public arena, which is now social media, if you are a polarizer. The polarizers do exceptionally well on social media. Now, Patrick and I were talking with Queen's students about this today. The algorithm is broken. The algorithm is corroding all of us, and we as humans have to fight back against that. Canadians can lead that charge. In fact, there's Canadians in Silicon Valley trying to do this. But it's important for our government, and it's hard when the votes are there if you polarize. But to be that bridge builder, and to work with our expats who, in places like China and Saudi Arabia, but also in places like Indonesia, I suspect, are very effective bridge builders because of all that cultural and strengths and natural empathy that Canadians tend to have. That is actually goes a long way in those places. So how do we, when we're trying to build relations with, let's say, China, and it won't be easy, and I'm not suggesting we should go about this blithely or lightly, but how do we work with the significant Canadian population in China to say, our government may have to take a position on some things, but you're there, you're devoting a good chunk of your lives there. Teaching in schools, working in hospitals, running businesses. I profile a guy named Mike Evans, who's president of Alibaba, a Canadian. How do we work with people like him? Say, let's not try to necessarily resolve a particular issue, although that can and does work, but to strengthen our relationships across the country. I said this to the student group this afternoon. it's easier to dislike and certainly hate what you don't know. And if you go to rural China or Saudi Arabia or any other corner of the world today, or middle of Kansas, and say you're Canadian, I don't think people are going to curse you the way maybe their governments do. I think they're going to respect you and like you and welcome you. And you will probably come to know them as humans and get to like them and respect their culture a bit more. And probably come home and go, it's a little more complicated. And that's the opposable mind. It's easy to say, country X is like this. You know, it's a little more complicated. And that is the great Canadian answer. And it's not one we should apologize for, because that's where we're valued at the table when others are saying it's black or it's white, it's north or it's south. We're the ones who say it's a little more complicated, and maybe we should understand it better.
Well, and John,
and our expats have to help us with that.
And John, here's actually a question that goes right to that from Francine Hamp, who asks, do you have any thoughts about Canadian third culture kids, the children of expats growing up outside overseas? How can Canada leverage this resource? Many of them return to Canada for post-secondary.
Absolutely. It's a great question and a great opportunity, because it's interesting. It was interesting to watch when sort of the Trump and the Brexit phenomenons took off. And many in government and elsewhere thought, this is our chance to get people to come back. And like, we even put billboards up on highways in Silicon Valley and say, come home. Look, I get the sentiment and it's fine. I go through this in the book. A vast amount of research on expatriates from any number of countries around the world don't come back. Once people leave, they tend to stay away. So let's accept that. Let's work with that. There's a guy named Scott Bonham, Queen's grad, and Queen's engineering grad in Silicon Valley, who's been out of the country for 30 years and is passionately Canadian. And now he's on 3 Canadian corporate boards. He says, I'm more valuable to Canada here than I would be back home. And he's as Canadian today as when the day he left, maybe more so. And his kids, who have grown up, they're American, but he's getting them Canadian citizenship, are and should feel attached to Canada. The onus is on us to reach them, to communicate with them. That's why we need to really lean into this, to get them coming to events and circulating with others, and say to them, look, you're American, you're going to stay in America. If you want to come here for university, that's fine. It's a really good question about, do we give you a kind of a home country discount? I think that's something we should put on the table, but at least consider. Do we give them voting rights? That's a little more challenging, but at least worth talking about. So a big opportunity there, including for our universities.
Absolutely. I've got a question here from an anonymous attendee. Hi, John. For the expats who did express the desire to stay connected to Canada, what did they say was their biggest barrier to their continued involvement? And what is the number one thing that Canada would lose out on by not maintaining robust networks for expats? Those are 2 kind of questions there, but yeah.
Yeah, I think we need to appreciate there's almost this kind of antithetical nature to expats and government people and to bureaucrats. People who leave their home, it takes a certain kind of person to leave your home and to stay away for an extended period of time. You are maybe a misfit, maybe a rebel, maybe a bit of a vagabond, but you're not a conformist. And bureaucrats, and I don't mean this critically, you have to conform to the bureaucracy. You have to live within the limits. And expats are often people who want to step beyond the limits, to test beyond the limits. And when we ask our bureaucracy to work with expats and vice versa, we need to appreciate that this is a bit of Venus and Mars. And that's okay. We need bureaucrats to be bureaucrats, but we also got to let expats be expats. Don't expect them to be bureaucrats. So let them be a bit, take us to maybe some uncomfortable places. Let them lead. Don't tell them what to do. They're not sitting there saying, I'm waiting for my instructions, for my talking points to come from the High Commission so I can call up or go on social media and, cut and paste a tweet on behalf of my country. They're not wired that way. So let them be themselves, but also take us farther, but listen to them. And this is the frustration I heard, is that if they got a call from the government, it was usually, can you say this, or you should know this, rather than, what should we be thinking? There's a woman in the book who is one of the most senior people, and certainly females in Silicon Valley, who is now semi-retired, but knows more about networks. She was very senior and early on at Google than probably anyone in Canada. And she said, like, it always surprised me that no one in the government of Canada ever called me, because she's like on speed dial with the CEO of pretty much every tech company in the world, and said, what should we think about our network policy? So we need to listen more and then act upon that, which is why I suggest this group of, through Rideau Hall, bring them back, start like produce policy papers and recommendations out of them, develop, it's almost like a working think tank, so that if we are, we're looking at our immigration policy today, for instance, well, we should have expats helping to lead that. Or we look at our innovation policy, when we look at our universities policy, the heads of Stanford and Cambridge and Johns Hopkins, three of the world's best universities, are Canadian. The former heads of Berkeley and Princeton, among others, are Canadian. There are Canadians around the world who know a thing or two about running universities. That doesn't make them better or worse than Patrick and the great university heads here, but they have a perspective. So could we put them together? And we've done this I'm not saying this hasn't been done before. We just need to do it consistently and regardless of who is in government, to say, okay, you sort of subgroup of university thinkers around the world, help us think about our post-secondary education policy. Come to us with something really disturbing and unsettling, make us uncomfortable, challenge us. And I think if I'm a government, I kind of want that, because I can say, those crazy expats, but they do run Stanford or Cambridge, so they probably know what they're talking about. They're telling us to do this, because Canadians, like, we love that validation of the big leagues, which a lot of expats joke about. But there's a tremendous opportunity there. So great question. Sorry for the long answer, but it's about listening.
Absolutely. I think actually you've done a lot of that work yourself in challenging us to think in new ways, specifically on this issue, but just what it means to be Canadian and how we can leverage that. And just to round us out, Kate Armstrong says that you made her think of a joke that as Canadians, we are proud of our humility. And I think that this conversation, there's a certain pride here, but certainly in reading your book, there is. So, John, I wanted to take the second to thank you for having this conversation, which has been really interesting, but also for your book, Planet Canada. Yeah, thank you so much, John.
Oh, Ben, thank you for a really rich conversation, great questions, and really appreciate everyone, especially those dialing in from all places in very difficult circumstances, for plugging into the Canadian conversation. Let's keep it going.
Excellent. I'm going to pass it back to Barbara Bell to close us out.
Thanks, Ben. And thank you, John, Stackhouse, and Ben. It's been a fascinating discussion, and we could go on and on. There's just so much to unpack here. A reminder that John's book, Planet Canada, How Our Expats Are Shaping the Future, is available for purchase here in Kingston at Novel Idea, but certainly, as John has mentioned, online. Highly recommended. Thanks, Novel Idea. Thanks, Penguin Random House Canada. And a special thanks to our community partner, the Office of the Principal at Queen's University. For some closing comments, I invite Principal Dean to say a few words.
Well, thanks very much, Barbara. And thanks to John and Ben for a really very stimulating hour's discussion. It was wonderful. A special thanks to Ben for giving me the titillating experience of being even suspected of Zoom bombing. It's been great to be here.
Not a problem.
I was here from the beginning. I had some technical difficulties getting on. John mentioned that we had a really great session this afternoon with, I think, about 10 students talking about some of the issues that we've gone into tonight. It was actually a really great conversation, and I found it a moving one. because the students today are looking towards a future that is infinitely more complex than the recent history we've all experienced, particularly when it comes to the whole question of our international engagements and their international obligations and activities. And I think they found it very stimulating to hear from John on the subject, as I have again tonight. And thanks, Ben, for taking John more deeply into the complexities of his book and his thinking about this. It's been a very, very stimulating evening. So thank you to you both. I should say, by the way, the question of John's continuing relationship with Queen's came up. He's, of course, a proud alumnus, but he's also a member of our Board of Trustees. And we're very fortunate to have his perspective and his experience to guide us in some of the decisions we make. Because we as an institution are facing some extraordinary challenges in this regard as well. Barbara, we're very pleased, the university and my office in particular, to be a community partner with Kingston Writers Fest for this event. And more broadly, I want to say we're really grateful for the opportunities that the Writers Fest brings to our community and also to the Queen's community within it, to learn from writers and thinkers, and hear an issue very close to the heart of an English professor to share in the power of the written word. So thank you, Barbara, for all you do. Thanks to John, and thanks to Ben for a very, very interesting and stimulating evening.
And thank you so much, Dr. Dean, and I look forward to a continued collaboration in the future. I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening and for supporting Kingston Writers Fest. I do hope you'll continue to come on board with us for 4 more days of exciting, compelling, and topical programming. So be sure to check kingstonwritersfest.ca for dates and times, and I wish you all a good night.